Hello, welcome back to the channel, Flesh to the Father. In today's video, I'm going to explain how each Abrahamic religion abuses its followers and the answer to the problems of the Abrahamic religions. Let's go. Okay, I'm going to go through each religion. We're going to start with Judaism. So when people are born into Judaism, there's the idea that the Jews are the chosen ones by God. And there's also this idea that they're almost a victim, and that at the end of times, the world's going to go against the Jews, but God's going to save them and all this stuff. And that's the two main traits I've identified with Judaism. And what this leads to is when people think they're chosen ones, it leads to egotism and narcissism. And also, when people are told they're a victim, they have a victim mentality. And you can see how this is manifested in the Judaism and Jewish people. Now, to call Jewish people narcissist is way over the top, but there is a certain amount of egotism when you're told you're a chosen one. And also, we can definitely see how the victim mentality has manifested. And I'm not saying that any of this is their fault, but this is how the abuse of religion creates psychosis in people. And especially when you look at the Jews, when you tell people certain things, they live as a self-fulfilling prophecy. So obviously the Holocaust was disgusting what happened, but in a way, when you have these beliefs, they manifest. It's almost how creation is set up. So when you constantly think you're a victim, you're going to be put in situations where you are a victim. And an analogy would be if you had a young black child raised by a mother and father in the West, let's say, and you told this child from the day he was born, everybody in this country is racist, you're going to be hated, you're going to struggle your whole life, the police hate you, the teachers hate you, you got to stand up and fight. This child will see racism everywhere because he's been told. Even when there is no racism present, they're going to see it everywhere because they've been programmed into this abusive system. And alternatively, if you tell a young black person, okay, look, there may be a tiny amount of people who are racist, but most people are good, and if you work hard and you do everything you need to do, you can achieve whatever you want. They're going to go out in the world and they're not going to see racism. They're going to be able to achieve because they've not been programmed and abused in the other way of being a victim. So that's how the Jews have become almost a little bit egotistical and have a victim mentality. Next, we're going to move on to the Christians. Okay, and now we're moving on to the Christians and Christianity. And when you're born into Christianity, you're told you're a born sinner. But then you're also told that when you accept Christ and you become a Christian, you're now the chosen one rather than the Jews. Now, what does this lead to? When you're told you're a born sinner, obviously you're going to be born feeling a lot of guilt. And then when you're told that you're a chosen one after accepting Christ and becoming a Christian, Christians seem to have a savior complex. Not so much egotism and narcissism. There is a lot of egotism among Christians, but it's more intellectual. For reading the Bible, they think that makes them spiritually wise, but it just leads to egotism of the intellectual ego. And also I've noticed with Christians is they're very, very paranoid. And that's all to do with their false idea of Satan and end times prophecies, all this stuff, which is a load of rubbish. And this is obviously birthed from the idea of Jesus dying on the cross to save us from hell and to overcome Satan, which was just a complete made up concept. If it was true in terms of it may have been a spiritual analogy rather than a literal story. And you do see how a lot of Christians are abused. One thing I've noticed is when people are born into hardcore Christian family, they end up leaving the faith. And they were born feeling guilty. So anything, if they had sexual attraction to the opposite sex when they become teenagers, it's guilt. You know, if anything they do that's worldly, they're told they're wrong, it's evil because Satan's tempting you and all this stuff. And whilst there is some truth to it, it's more that we should stay in the spirit and overcome the flesh rather than this spiritual warfare between Satan and all this stuff that's way, way over dramatized. And as with the Jews, once they become Christians or they say they accept Christ, they are now the chosen one, and there is a bit of pride that comes along with it. And they also have a savior complex. If Christians have this idea, they have to go around saving everybody, you know, knocking on people's doors. The evangelicals are obsessed with saving the Jews because, they're blind, they haven't accepted Christ. And it's all mostly a load of rubbish. In that there are no chosen ones. In the spirit, we're all equal. but we'll come to that later. And the final point on the Christians is there's a lot of paranoia you see with Christians because of this false idea of Jesus dying on the cross to save us from Satan and hell and all this spiritual battle. There's a lot of paranoia. You see them, oh, the Antichrist's coming. Jesus is going to come soon. We're going to rapture. I'm going to fly up in the air into the clouds, meet Jesus, and we're going to go back down to earth and defeat all our enemies. It's just a fantasy and a story, not based in any spiritual truth, but just pure delusion. And it simply come from worldly, intellectual, egotistical, not in terms of egotistical as in prideful, but egotistical when they're lost in the flesh. People trying to understand spiritual wisdom and they don't understand it. And this is the problem that Jesus had. That's why it's Christianity that's the problem, not Jesus Christ that is the problem. Because Jesus Christ most likely, or I'm sure he didn't teach all this stuff about dying on the cross. This was made up later by the Bible writers and the intellectuals of our world. Okay, so that's my point on Christianity. Next, we'll move to Islam. Okay, now on to Islam. When Muslims are born into the religion of Islam, because Prophet Muhammad was rejected by the Jews and the Christians, there's a spirit of rejection that they inherit from the Prophet Muhammad. And it's prevalent throughout the Quran, throughout Muhammad's life, and throughout the history of Islam. So there's a spirit of rejection. And there's also jihad. There's this idea of they have to overcome the world. There has to be a caliphate. Islam must be dominant in the world. That's the two main concepts of Islam in terms of how they inherit and what they're told. And what this leads to is there's insecurity. And this is from the Prophet Muhammad, and that's passed on to the Muslims. So if you noticed that not so much that Muslims are insecure, it's that because Prophet Muhammad was insecure, they're abused by that insecurity. And you can tell why, because what is the punishment of leaving Islam? If you leave Islam, the punishment is death. And it's the same way that just proves their insecurity. If people are secure, they don't need to threaten anyone. For an example, if I'm in a relationship with a woman, or let's say I'm married and I'm just very secure with myself, I'll say, well, if you want to leave. I'll be disappointed, but I'm not going to be obsessed with you staying. I don't care. Whereas if I was insecure, I'd say, you leave me, I'm going to kill you. Imagine how mental that would be if I said to my wife, you leave me, I'll kill you. That's just pure insecurity. And that will abuse my wife, and she'll have this living with fear and paranoia. And that's what happens with Muslims, because they're born into this sort of cult, as all the religions are cults, but they're born into this cult of fear, rejection. Unfortunately, they have been abused by it. And if they were to leave it and escape it, they've got this fear of, oh no, the penalty is death, or I'll be rejected by my family, my friends. So the prospect of them leaving is very, very hard. And in that way, I do feel sorry for them. And when we come on to jihad, obviously this idea of jihad and spreading it by the world, it leads to a lot of violence. And you see this throughout the history of Islam. There's a lot of spreading it by the sword, terrorism, jihad. And while some may see it's misunderstood, the reality is it is dangerous, and we have violence and terrorism all throughout the history of Islam. And most Muslims actually justify it and say that it's justified. So this is not anything controversial that I'm saying. It's sort of like accepted fact within Islam, and that jihad and violence is acceptable and necessary to spread the caliphate around the world. Okay, so that's how each people are abused by their religion that they are born into. And now the most important thing, as always, is the answer to our problems. And just as the problem was being born into each religion, the answer is to be born again. And born again means spiritually reborn. And this is what Jesus Christ taught of, which is the truth, and that all spiritual wisdom throughout our ages has essentially taught. Because that wisdom comes from our spiritual father, and the spiritual father is the answer to our problems. Now, the true simple meaning of spiritual rebirth and being spiritually reborn is essentially putting in spiritual work of fasting, meditation, asking for the Father to draw you near. It essentially means that you overcome the egotism and the flesh, and you return to the spirit, in terms of you realize that you are literally a spirit. You are not just the flesh and blood. And when you realize that you are an actual spirit, the awareness within you, the one that is observing the thoughts, that is your spirit, and your conscience is also your spirit. that has to have had a creator, because your physical parents who made you become religious, they created your physical body, but who created your spiritual body? And then you realize, I must have a spiritual father. And then upon that realization that you are a spirit, you are resurrected. And as you can see from my picture there, once spiritual resurrection takes place, the 3 arrows from the religions, you leave your religion, you're spiritually resurrected, and then you'll actually go to the top of the picture, you return to the spiritual father. And then, as Jesus Christ said, you will not be from beneath, you'll be from above, because you'll be from the spirit rather than the flesh. And in the spirit, we are all one, we're united. And when we are united in the spirit, we lose all this state of paranoia, egotism, narcissism, violence, jihad. All this stuff will disappear. All the spirit of rejection, the spirit of guilt, all this stuff that has abused us all our lives will disappear, and we'll take on the spirit of our Father, which is perfect love and wisdom as portrayed through Jesus Christ. And that is what we need to do. That is the kingdom of heaven. When we're in the spirit, that is the kingdom of heaven on earth, not when we die. This is what Jesus talked about. When he talks about the kingdom of heaven, he talked about it being on earth, and not when he comes back in some fantasy story, but when we do the work individually ourselves, we can bring it to earth with the help of our spiritual father and the true teachings of Jesus Christ. Okay, so I hope that makes sense. Something I was thinking about, and it definitely does show how people born into religion are somewhat abused, and the ultimate goal is to leave the religion and return to the Father. If you have any comments, please put them below. If you like the video, like it, share it with people to spread the word about uniting in the spirit and leaving these ridiculous religions. On that note, God bless everyone. Goodbye.